They tied his hands, slit his side, and dumped him in the swamp to rot. What they never knew was this: the boy they murdered didn't die alone in that water. His name was Hayden Orwell, 23 years old, the youngest son of a border house nobody feared. Last night his family owned land, a name, a future. Tonight the estate is ash, his parents and older brother are dead, and his name is crossed out of the family register forever. But something rode into that swamp with him, something that shouldn't exist inside a nobleman's son. A second mind, cold, trained, awake. Hayden chokes on black swamp water and rolls onto his side, vomiting sludge into the reeds. His wrists are bound, a rope circles his throat, under his ribs. A wound throbs like a second heartbeat. Fog presses down around him, thick, sweet, rotten. And inside his skull, two voices are already fighting for control. One screams, "Your name is Hayden Orwell. Your family is dead. You were stabbed and thrown away like garbage." The other stays perfectly calm. "You are a military intelligence analyst. 7 years in war zones. Maps, interrogations, survival." Both voices are true. Both are him now. Neither one is going to drag him out of icy water with his hands still tied. So he does the only thing either version of him knows how to do. He stops panicking, and he starts counting. Who attacked him? How many? Where they came from? He works the rope against a root under the water, patient, methodical, like a man defusing a bomb. 10 minutes pass, his fingers go numb. Blood clouds the water brow. Then his hands come free. He lifts his head above the surface, and that's when the strangest thing in either of his lives begins. Thin glowing lines rise out of the mist, as if someone is sketching the world in front of him with light. One line cuts straight through the marsh to a hidden ford. Solid bottom, safe passage. Beyond it, a dry islet, 2 men in dull red cloaks, crossbows. A confirmation team sent to make absolutely sure the boy is dead. Hayden sinks until only his eyes and nose break the surface. His heart is slamming against his ribs. He clamps a hand over his own chest. Not now. Watch first. For a full hour, he does nothing but watch. Every 6 minutes, the crossbowman on the left glances away, distracted by rats gnawing at his pack. The one on the right favors his left leg. An old injury. He can't turn quickly to the right. There is a blind spot between them, exactly where the wind is blowing from. Hayden doesn't crawl toward them. He crawls between them. His fingers close around a rusted gaff hook lying underwater, heavy, long enough. He moves so slowly the birds never take flight. He rises behind the injured man from his blind side and strikes not at flesh, but at the bowstring. It snaps with a sharp crack. The bolt fires straight up into the sky. The man screams. His partner spins toward the sound and fires on instinct. The bolt buries itself in his own partner's chest. The whole exchange takes for seconds. A minute later, Hayden has 2 crossbows, dry boots, a cloak, a knife, and salted meat, and the first entry on a map that exists only in his head. These men knew exactly where his wound was. That means whoever sent them was at the estate that night. That means Hayden will recognize his face when he finds him. He drags the bodies into the water and looks into the eyes of the dying one, wanting a name. The man stops breathing before he gives one. Hayden feels no grief, only clarity, sharp and cold as the swamp itself. Someone powerful enough to erase an entire noble house in a single night wants him gone. Not a baron's level of enemy, not a count's. This is chancellery business, maybe higher. To the south lie the gray marshes, the place Ainwald sends everyone it wants to forget. Outcast, deserters, fugitives, people without names, without law, without a future. The crown pretends the swamp doesn't exist. No tax collectors, no witnesses, no justice. Hayden looks down at his own hands, soft, unscarred, a nobleman's hands that have never worked. But behind those hands sit 7 years of reading liars in interrogation rooms, of turning chaos into structure. And now that skill works differently. Those glowing lines in the air aren't a delusion. They're a map, a living, breathing map of the terrain, updating with every single step he takes. He heads deeper south, further from anyone who might still be hunting him. Every stone, every bend in the water, burns itself permanently into his mind. By nightfall, he knows this stretch of marsh better than any living soul. He finds an island the size of a room. 3 ancient willows with roots woven into a natural platform. Only one approach, a narrow ridge invisible to anyone who doesn't already know it's there. He lights a small, smokeless fire and washes his wound with a filthy strip of cloth. It's a terrible bandage. By morning it will be inflamed. But morning is a problem for morning. He gnaws on tough, oversalted meat and calls it the best meal of either of his lives. He doesn't think about revenge. Not yet. He thinks about structure. The Orwell land sat on the border of the marshes, strategic ground, not wealth, not power. Position. Someone wanted that position badly enough to burn a family alive for it. The map in his mind pulses quietly, patient, hungry, waiting for more data. And Hayden makes it a promise. They think he's dead. They are about to find out how wrong they are. Tomorrow the map grows. Tomorrow he finds the first living person in these swamps. And he'll keep finding them, one thread at a time, until he has enough to pull the whole thing apart. Sleep comes fast, heavy, black. And somewhere far beneath the swamp, in ruins 1,000 years old, something ancient shifts in its sleep. Something patient. Something that has been waiting a very, very long time. Morning in the marshes doesn't arrive. The darkness just turns gray. Hayden wakes to pain, his wound hot, red, swollen with infection. He eats the last of the meat and drinks water strained through cloth, tasting of iron and rot. He'll have to get used to that taste, because this swamp is home now. Overnight, the map updated itself without him even asking. Something large passed nearby, for legs. Not human. He touches that knowledge the way you touch a sore tooth, and moves on, heading south. An hour later he crosses a channel and finds footprints on the far bank. Bare, small, a woman. Or a teenager. He follows them, not out of curiosity, but because someone who survives here knows how to keep surviving. 2 hours later, he finds a hut. Calling it a hut is generous. For post, a roof of turf, one woven wall, the rest open to the wind. Inside, a woman with tangled red hair lies on a bed of moss, feverish, gray-green eyes sharp with suspicion. Her left arm is wrapped from shoulder to wrist. An old burn. Her right hand holds a rusty knife, correctly, the way someone taught her to hold it. Hayden stops 5 paces away and reads her instantly. Dislocated ankle. Hasn't eaten in 2 days. An herbalist by trade. He sees her knuckles whiten around the knife handle. She's waiting for him to attack. Instead, he crouches down slowly and sets his own blade on the ground, pushing it away. It takes 10 seconds before she finally speaks. She was accused of cursing livestock. Villagers came at night with torches. She ran into the swamp and never stopped running. Hayden asks which herbs reduce inflammation. She names 3. He recognizes 2, and the map lights up the exact location. 20 minutes later he returns with 5 different plants, not 3. She asks how he knew which ones she hadn't even named. He has no honest answer to give her. She studies him for a long moment. Then she finally puts the knife away. Her name is Era Lowe, 26, once a village healer, now just a survivor in the swamp. Hayden gives only his first name, no house, no past, not yet. She treats his wound properly, mixing the herbs with swamp clay so the sap won't burn his skin. Her hands move fast and sure, even with one of them scarred by fire. Slowly, the heat in his wound begins to fade. That evening, Hayden repairs her collapsing roof without being asked. Era wakes, sees the new wall, says nothing, and simply looks at it for a long time. This is where it truly begins. Not a rescue. Not charity. The very first thread of something bigger. For 5 days, Hayden leaves at dawn and returns at dusk, mapping a little more of the world each time. He finds clean water, edible berries, a rotting fishing net he mends and sets in the current. Every day he brings back raw materials. Every day Era turns them into something that keeps them both alive. By the 5th day, the map covers half a day's walk in every direction, and he starts noticing threads. The old fishing net is tied with a southern knot, meaning someone from outside these swamps has been here before. The barefoot tracks that led him to Era's hut weren't hers. She can't walk. Someone else came first and left. On the 6th day, Era finally asks the question she's been holding back. Why is a nobleman's son hiding in a swamp with a knife wound? Hayden tells her the truth, or most of it. His family was slaughtered. He was left for dead. He no longer officially exists. Era only nods like he's described the weather. Everyone in the marshes has a version of that same story. She warns him about winter, how the ice looks solid but isn't, how it will kill anyone unprepared. The map already knows the answer. An abandoned mill, half-sunken water, stone walls, defensible, big enough for 12 people. On the 7th day, Era's ankle finally holds her weight. They set out for the mill together. Hayden leads along dry ridges only the map can see, placing every footstep with total precision. The mill is better than expected. Thick stone walls, most of the roof intact, dry ground raised above the water. Era looks around and for the first time in a week, there's something in her eyes besides exhaustion. It isn't trust yet, but it's close. They spend 10 days settling in, building a hearth, patching the breach in the wall, hauling clay for mortar. The mill starts to smell like wormwood and dried mint instead of rot. It starts to smell like a home. On a scouting run, Hayden finds a sunken wagon train buried decades in the mud, and inside, a blacksmith's toolkit. Good steel, still intact under the rust. He takes the tools and marks the spot for later. On the way back, the map flags a motionless figure in the trees. An old man, one blind eye, a broken sword across his lap. His name is Goran, 12, maybe 13 years in these marshes. He's lost count. His crippled fingers, fused wrong from an old burn. Tell Hayden everything before the man says a word. A blacksmith. Goran says the sword on his lap was forged for a young baron, long dead, in another life entirely. Hayden lays the recovered blacksmith's tools in front of him without a word. He tells him about the mill, the stone walls, the hearth, 20 kilograms of raw bog iron waiting nearby. He says one simple thing. I need a blacksmith. Goran picks up the hammer with his ruined hand, turns it over, and says quietly that it's good steel. Then he stands up and says he'll lead the way. That night, Goran begins carving an anvil out of an old millstone with fingers that shouldn't be able to hold a chisel. Hayden lies by the fire and listens to the pounding, steady, dull, like a heartbeat. 3 people now share this mill. Air heals. Goran forges. Hayden finds. It isn't an army. It isn't even a plan yet, but it's a start, and starts have a way of growing. 3 days later, Goran forges his first blade in 12 years, small, crooked, but sharp. He holds it like it's alive. Hayden pushes further north, scouting the border of dry land, memorizing patrols, routes, uniforms. A fox crest on green. House Westmar, a patrol riding south along the marshes without ever entering them, routine. Unbothered. On the way back he meets a boy, 12 years old, barefoot, gathering berries because there's nothing left to eat at home. His name is Tobias. His village has a new steward from House Westmar, who takes half the harvest for himself. 2 men were hanged last month simply for failing to pay. Hayden offers him dried meat, then a standing deal. Come back every week. Bring news. Get food and warmth in return. Tobias agrees, and just like that, Hayden's very first line into the dry lands opens up. Thin, fragile, held together by nothing but a boy's hunger, but real. A week later, Tobias returns with something enormous. A mercenary captain has been bragging drunk in the village tavern. He says he finished a big job for the Westmers, enough money to last until spring. Burn scar on his right arm, limp in his left leg. Not hiding, not afraid. Certain there's no one left alive to avenge his crime. Hayden lies awake by the hearth and lets the image burn into his mind. That man was at the Orwell estate. That man personally lit the fire, personally held the knife. He feels no rage. Rage is a liability. He feels the same cold clarity from that first night in the swamp. A single dot on the map that needs to disappear so cleanly that everyone calls it an accident. He spends 7 days preparing, because haste kills more surely than any blade. Through Tobias, he learns everything. The captain's name is Derek Fall, his route home, his schedule, his habits. Every evening, Derek walks alone down a narrow forest path back to his inn. No guards. No one is looking for him. Hayden walks that same path twice, once by day, once at midnight, memorizing every rock, every root, every shadow. Derek Fall is bigger, stronger, an experienced fighter, even drunk. A straight fight means death for Hayden, so there won't be one. For days later, Tobias brings the final piece. Derek is smuggling salt across the swamp alone. At night, no partners. Greed, plain and simple. He just slaughtered a noble house for gold. So a little salt smuggling feels like nothing. Hayden already knows the trail. A sharp bend, a cliff edge crumbling from within. Black water waiting below. At dawn he pries loose the one stone silently holding the road together, and covers every trace. Then he catches a large marsh toad, the kind of sound that spooks any horse in an instant. 3 nights later, he lies hidden in the reeds and waits. Patience is a scout's sharpest weapon. At midnight, wheels creak in the dark. Derek Fall, sober tonight, alert, guiding the loaded cart along the bend. Hayden throws the toad. It shrieks in front of the horse. The animal bolts toward the weakened edge. The ground gives way beneath the wagon in eerie slow motion. Salt, horse, man, all crash into black water. A splash, a cry, then silence. Hayden counts the minutes. In the 4th minute, a head breaks the surface, clawing for a root that won't hold. His bad leg won't kick, his burned hand can't grip. He slips, surfaces, slips again. The 3rd time, Derek Fall does not come back up. Hayden feels no satisfaction, no relief, nothing but the same cold clarity. One name erased from the map. He resets the loose stone perfectly. By morning, this is nothing but a drunk mercenary's fatal accident. Nobody investigates. Nobody avenges a man like Derek Fall. At the mill, Era doesn't ask questions. She simply pours him hot tea and watches his hands finally stop shaking. Weeks pass. Goran forges faster. One knife a day now, rough but sharp. Hidden along every safe trail. In the third week after Derek's death, new arrivals appear. A one-armed veteran and his pregnant wife, guided by Tobias. His name is Renard. He served, lost an arm, and was discharged with nothing. Hayden takes them in without hesitation. Era says the baby is healthy, still 2 months away. Renard asks what Hayden wants in return. Hayden says, for now, nothing. Renard smirks and says nothing comes free except in fairy tales. Hayden shrugs and says maybe this is one. 3 days later, Renard is already working the anvil beside Goran, holding the metal steady with his one good hand. The mill is filling up fast. 5 people, soon 6. And in the far south, the map lights up with something Hayden has never seen before. Bright, enormous, ancient, underwater. He marks it and moves on. People first, secrets later. By the end of the month, 7 people call the mill home, each one carrying the exact same story in a different voice. Killed, driven out, erased. The marsh takes them all in. The first month in the swamp ends. 1 mill, 1 blacksmith, 1 healer, 1 dead mercenary at the bottom of a channel. Small, fragile, but it is a beginning. And beginnings only need to survive long enough to become something else. The second month opens with 4 days of relentless rain. Water creeps up to the mill's threshold, threatening to flood them out. Hayden digs a drainage trench in the storm, and Renard joins him, one-handed, without a word of complaint. By noon, the water diverts around the mill. Renard tells him that for a nobleman, Hayden digs surprisingly well. Hayden says he isn't a nobleman. Renard doesn't buy it, but he doesn't push either. Winter is coming, and the math is brutal. 8 mouths soon, 3 months of frozen ground. Barely a tenth of the food they'll need. Hayden turns hunter, not with a sword, with traps and snares, guided precisely by the map in his head. Slowly the mill fills with dried fish, salted meat, the smell of smoke instead of damp and rot. Then Tobias brings darker news. 10 armed Westmar men are coming to clear vagrants from the swamp. 3 days out. 10 mercenaries are not drowsy crossbowmen. This is a real squad, armed, experienced. Against them stand 7 people, only one of whom, Renard, can truly fight. And even then, with 1 arm. Direct combat is suicide. So Hayden decides they won't fight the mercenaries at all. He'll let the swamp do it for him. He blocks the real ford with fallen trees disguised as natural windfall, forcing the squad to search for another crossing. Then he lays a false trail, curving and deliberate, leading toward a second ford that only looks solid. Beneath its thin clay skin lies bottomless peat, steppin', and in 1 minute only an arm remains above water. A straight trap would be obvious to a good commander. A meandering one that looks like his own discovery is not. The mercenaries arrive exactly on schedule. They find the blockage, they find the false trail. They take the bait. A scout crosses the first 3 safe steps of the false ford and waves the squad forward. All clear. 8 men march in shoulder to shoulder, exactly as trained soldiers do. Exactly the weight the peat cannot hold. The ground gives way beneath all 8 at once, like a trapdoor swallowing them whole. Swords are useless. Crossbows are soaked. There is no bottom to grab. Only liquid mud pulling them under. The commander watches from solid ground, powerless, as 8 of his men vanish without a single sound. 2 survivors flee north at a dead run. 10 came to leave. 8 lie at the bottom of the marsh. Hayden's hands are shaking again, just like after Derek fall. 8 lives ended by 3 logs and a fake trail. He tells the mill only that the enemy is left, that they won't return soon, but that they will return larger. Renard asks how many came, how many left, and how it happened. Hayden answers with 1 word: the swamp. From that day, Renard sees him differently. Not a hiding nobleman anymore, but a man worth following. That night, Hayden lies awake with 8 new dead names weighing on the map inside his mind. He refuses to let himself dwell on it, because if he starts, he knows he won't be able to stop. The Westmers now know something dangerous lives in the marshes. That knowledge will change everything that follows. His next move was never about traps. It's about people. And every new person is a brick in a wall the swamp can't drown. Weeks later, Renard's wife Oda gives birth to a son named Aiden. And Renard tells Hayden he finally has something to protect. He says that if Hayden ever needs a soldier, he's found one. And the bond between them hardens into something real. The map keeps expanding. South of the mill, Hayden discovers stone ruins jutting from the water. Remnants of a lost empire. The bright pulsing point he'd sensed before is here, somewhere beneath the flooded stone, enormous. Ancient. He wades in and the map floods with information, corridors, halls, staircases. All sealed and untouched for 1,000 years. 1 word arrives in his mind uninvited. Archive. The overload drops him to his knees, nose bleeding onto the rock. Too much data through one touch. He retreats. Whatever waits down there can wait a little longer. He isn't ready. On his way home, a woman is standing on the trail, calm, deliberate, clearly not hiding and not afraid. The map reads her instantly, military bearing, a well-kept blade, empty hands raised in open peace. She says she's been watching him for 3 days, learning how he moves, how he reads the land, how he kills without a sound. Her name is Maria Ashford, a former Crown intelligence agent, wanted with a bounty on her head. She spent 6 years gathering leverage that was later used to destroy small noble houses, just like Hayden's own. Once she understood what she was being used for, she ran. And now the Crown wants her dead or captured. Hayden lets his mental map read her pulse, her posture, her eyes. And every signal says the same thing. She isn't lying. He doesn't bring her to the mill right away. He houses her separately and visits every day to be certain. Over that week, she teaches him everything. Chains of command, how orders move, how documents are forged, how debts are fabricated. The map inside his head changes shape entirely. It stops being only trails and fords and becomes people, money, power. At the center of that web sits House Westmar, and beside it, a shadow, someone even higher. In the capital itself. 10 days later, Maria finally comes to the mill. Era offers her tea. One former tool of powerful men to another. It is winter's 3rd month, and the marshes are unforgiving. Ice looks like solid ground and lies just as easily. 12 people now live at the mill. And every night, Hayden lies awake stitching the day's information into the map. The cost is brutal. Overloaded nights leave him bleeding from the nose, blind for hours, wrung completely dry. Maria notices everything. She tells him about an intelligence officer she once knew who never learned to stop absorbing. By year 7, that man was found carving names into his office walls with his own fingernails. She isn't warning him about the ability. She's warning him about the cost of never putting it down. Hayden says he'll be more careful. Maria says people who say that are usually lying. And she's right, and he knows it. Supplies dwindle fast. By midwinter, 3 weeks of food remain, and 6 weeks of winter are still ahead. Hayden makes a risky call. He'll walk out to the dry lands not as a fugitive, but as a peddler selling knives. Goran has forged 18 blades, rough, ugly, but sharp enough to sell for 3 silver marks apiece. Maria calls it madness that the Westmers have a bounty on anyone from the marshes. Hayden says they're hunting a ghost, not a peddler. He walks out at dawn with a sack of knives on his back and for the first time in 3 months, feels solid ground. He sells at a roadside tavern, reads every person in the room in seconds out of old habit, and asks no questions in return. By nightfall, he sold 12 blades for 31 silver marks and traded that silver for flour, salt, blankets, and rope. He carries 40 kilograms home on his back through the swamp, arriving at dawn, exhausted, triumphant. When Era sees the flour, she says nothing. She just plunges her hand into it and lets it run through her fingers. An hour later, she returns with hot flatbread, and for the first time in months, 12 people eat together in silence. Hayden realizes shelter alone isn't enough. What they need is a system, a steady channel between the swamp and the world. Winter finally breaks, slowly, the way it began. The ice thins, darkens, and crumbles, and the water starts moving again. 12 people have survived the entire winter without a single loss. 3 months ago, that outcome felt impossible. The map now reveals something staggering. 47 people scattered through the marshes within today's walk, all hiding, all starving. With spring, Hayden starts building his network for real, one visit at a time, offering trade instead of demands. A knife for information on trails, a rope for word on fish. Never an interrogation, always just a conversation. In 3 weeks, he visits 11 camps and meets 26 people, each one a new thread stitched into the growing web. He learns of a native swamp clan to the south, 30 people who trust no outsiders and never have. He marks them on the map, but doesn't approach. Some doors need more time before you knock. That same week, 2 new arrivals appear on the northern trail, a young woman and a boy exhausted, walking for days. Her posture is straight despite the mud and hunger. An old aristocratic habit her body refuses to forget. Her name is Annalise Kane, daughter of a ruined trading house. Her father imprisoned on debts someone else fabricated. Her little brother Lucas holds her hand, 10 years old, eyes far too watchful for a child that age. Era feeds them both. Lucas eats like he's starving, because he is. Annalise eats slowly, controlled. Even now, 2 days later, Hayden pitches an idea to her, a proper trading post at the edge of the marsh. Annalise listens without interrupting, then asks 3 sharp questions about volume, channels, and pricing that Hayden can't fully answer. She explains how northern iron shortages could triple the value of their own swamp iron overnight, if timed right. Hayden offers her more than bookkeeping. He offers her the whole operation, her name, her rules, her people. She asks why her entire life, every offer ever made to her came with hidden strings attached. Hayden tells her plainly, there's a price, he needs a working trading post, and nobody could run it better than her. For the first time in her life, someone is offering her the chance to build something of her own. A week later she returns with a full plan sketched on birch bark, an abandoned pier, hidden from Westmar patrols. Hayden notices one missing line in her expenses, security. Annalise says that's his job. Trade is hers, and if he touches her columns, she'll touch his map. For the first time in a very long while, Hayden almost smiles. This is a partnership, not a hierarchy. Within 2 weeks the post is built, and a thin, fragile thread of trade opens between the marsh and the dry lands. By the end of the 3rd month, 14 people live at the mill, and every one of them has a role. It isn't a system yet, but it's no longer just coincidence either. Half a year into the marshes, Hayden decides to finally approach the swamp clan he's kept his distance from. Maria warns him that outsiders sometimes end up tied to trees, alive, but missing their tongues. He goes anyway, and unfamiliar swamp territory swallows the trail whole, forcing the map to build itself from nothing. 3 figures step silently from the trees before the map even registers them to hunters, and a young woman with a bow. Her name, in the dry tongue, is Yun. Wary, sharp-eyed, ready to move at the first wrong word. Hayden lowers his hands and asks to speak with the clan. Yun tells him bluntly that she decides who gets that privilege. He sits down without waiting for permission, unhurried, unafraid, and simply starts telling her a story. Not about alliances or trade, about the mill, about Era who heals, about Goran who forges, about a child crying under a stone roof. When he finishes, Yun asks why he told her all this. He says because neighbors deserve to know each other, even without friendship. She lets him leave alive, and warns him plainly that a second uninvited visit will cost him his fingers. A week later, she comes to the mill on her own, alone, unarmed, just to look. She walks past Goran at the anvil, past Era with her herbs, past Renard holding his son, and says nothing at all. Before leaving, she asks Hayden one question. Is he of the dry lands, or the marsh? He answers that he's neither. He's an outcast. Yun nods, as if that's finally the right answer. A month later, quiet trading begins, fish and hides for knives and salt, no words exchanged. No need for any. Meanwhile, Maria keeps feeding him the shape of the dry lands, name by name, title by title. Night after night. House Westmar now formally controls the old Orwell lands. The same peasants work them, only under a crueler master. Taxes have doubled. Men are being conscripted for construction. Quiet peasant anger is building beneath the surface. By the 6th month, roughly 40 people are connected to Hayden through the growing web of the marshes. Summer arrives, humid and thick with mosquitoes, but the trading post keeps turning a small, steady profit. Yun visits more and more often, sometimes with fish, sometimes just to sit on the mill's roof in silence. Hayden understands why without being told. She belongs fully to neither world and here. For the first time, she belongs somewhere. Then Tobias brings her words overheard from Lord Godfrey to Westmar himself. There's someone in the marshes. Hayden feels the map tremble, not with fear, but with anticipation. They've finally noticed him. Before preparing for retaliation, he prepares for something else entirely. His very first appearance as a man, not a ghost. Maria brings him proper clothes. Yun watches him put them on and asks, quietly, if he's still one of them. She isn't joking. She's afraid the dry lands will simply reclaim him and never give him back. He takes the cloak off and tells her plainly it's a tool, like a knife, like the map, nothing more. That night he walks alone to the estate of Henrik Westmar, the softer, quieter second son who never chose any of this. 2 hours of patient surveillance reveal every weak point, a sleepy guard, an unlocked kitchen door, a study lit past midnight. Hayden walks straight into that study at 1 in the morning and sits down across from him, like an equal. Henrik reaches for the alarm bell. Hayden simply says calm down, and tells him plainly he'd already be dead if that were the plan. He doesn't threaten him. He offers him something rarer. Real information his own father is hiding from him. He leaves behind 3 names on a strip of birch bark, proof of Stuart's stealing from Henrik in his father's name. He asks for nothing in return, not yet. Only tells Henrik the next piece of information will come at a price. 2 weeks later, word comes back through Tobias, every name checked out. Henrik dealt with it himself. And he sends back 2 words of his own. I'm listening. The first thread into House Westmar is thin, invisible, and very, very real. By the 8th month, Hayden finally draws the map onto real leather, because a map trapped only in his head dies with him. He hands the finished map to Maria, in case anything ever happens to him. She grips the leather like her last hope. A week later, Tobias comes running with the news Hayden has been dreading: 200 spears. A real army, a punitive expedition. Lord Gottfried has given the order himself. Burn everything. Hang everyone. Clear the marsh completely. 3 weeks to prepare. 200 spears against roughly 40 fighters, most unarmed. Open combat means annihilation, so there will be no open combat at all. Hayden decides to strike the logistics instead. An army isn't 200 men. It's food, water, gunpowder, tents, captains, medics, and clerks. A machine with removable parts. Through the trading post, he learns the supply routes. Masked men appear silently on the road, saying nothing, and the wagons turn back. A carved stone left behind reads a single word: swamp. The third supplier hears the rumors and simply never departs. A week later, the Westmers discover they have no way to feed 200 men on the march. Next, the captains. Soldiers follow captains, not cousins. Remove the captain, and the company falls apart on its own. One captain's secret debt is quietly paid off through a hidden channel, and forgiven the moment he falls conveniently ill. A second captain's hidden mistress receives a forged letter, and he abandons his post to chase a fire that never existed. The third captain is a hardened veteran, immune to bribery and lies, so Hayden visits him in person. At night, in his own tent, he wakes to a blade at his throat and a genuine Westmar order, describing 30 peasants scheduled for execution. Hayden offers to stop it if the captain simply fails to appear at roll call. By morning, he's gone. The last blow is the simplest. Hayden loosens boards on a gunpowder shed roof and waits for rain to finish the job. 3 weeks later, the detachment leaves the estate at only 120 men. Missing captains, food, and dry powder. They camp at the edge of the marsh. Desertions begin on day 2. Sick horses follow on day 3. Poison water, not fatal, just crippling. On the 4th day, the entire force turns around and marches home without firing a single shot. Renard watches them go and quietly tells Hayden he's starting to fear him. Hayden admits he's a little afraid of himself too. Fall arrives, 1 full year in the marshes. Envoys start arriving from 4 other ruined noble houses, all destroyed the same way. Hayden tells them plainly he isn't raising an army of vengeance. He's building a territory where being erased stops meaning being gone. He gives that place a name, the Lowlands, and he tells them the door is open, but they must enter quietly, one at a time. Then Tobias brings news that stops Hayden cold. A fair-haired girl at a distant convent might be someone from the Orwell household. Hayden's old memories surge back at once. His cousin, Lynette, 14 years old the night everything burned. He walks 2 days to the monastery alone and finds her in the infirmary, 17 now, tending a wounded stranger with a spoon. She looks up. Recognition floods her face before he says a single word. The spoon slips from her hand. She whispers his name and embraces him so tightly the old wound beneath his ribs aches, like it's fresh again. For 3 years she believed she was the last Orwell alive, hidden by a servant, raised under a false name in silence. They talk until dawn. Hayden tells her only part of the truth, enough for her to understand something is different about him. She doesn't press for more. She simply says home is wherever family is, and she's coming with him. 2 days later, they arrive at the mill together. Era welcomes her without question. Hayden calls her sister, and that is enough. Lynette becomes the thinnest and most important thread on the entire map, the one that ties Hayden back to who he used to be. A year and 3 months into the marshes, the Lowlands has grown to roughly 60 people across 3 connected strongholds. Hayden compiles a dossier in a leather notebook. 3 years of Westmar crimes, dates, names, forged seals, paid mercenaries. At the very end sits a letter from the Lord Chancellor himself, approving the erasure of House Orwell 3 full days before the massacre. It isn't just evidence anymore. It's a death sentence, and Henrik Westmar risked everything to steal it from his own father's safe. Meanwhile, contact begins with Cassandra, Henrik's brother's imprisoned wife, feeding documents through a chain of hands that never see each other. They meet in person at the trading post disguised as a customer, calm on the surface, steel underneath. She describes a marriage that's really a cage, watched, controlled, treated as property with a title attached. Hayden offers her something specific, not rescue, an exit, a rope she climbs out on herself. The plan takes a month, a staged illness, real symptoms from real herbs, a slow retreat to a country house, and finally an escape. A dress and a note are left by a riverbank. 2 words, forgive me. Her husband mourns for 3 days and forgets her in a month. Cassandra arrives at the monastery at night, wet, frozen, and finally, genuinely free. She asks Hayden if he can get her out, and this time she means her old name too. But she keeps it. It's the only thing that's ever truly been hers. Winter passes into his second year, and Henrik brings devastating news through the network. The old king has died. The throne is unstable. Lord Gottfried wants to become the new king's right hand, and to do that, he needs a spectacular victory. Destroy the lowlands, bring back the marsh leader's head. That victory is exactly what he's planning to deliver. This time, it isn't 200 spears. It's 3,000. Backed by a royal charter and a witchcraft tribunal. Against them stand 80 people, most unarmed. This isn't a battle to survive. It's a wall of steel with nowhere to hide. Hayden gathers everyone in the monastery hall for the first time, all of them together, and lays out the only plan he has left. He will not run. He will not fight. He will walk out to meet the army alone. On the old stone bridge, with the notebook, Maria calls it suicide. Hayden shakes his head. Gottfried won't know how many copies exist, or who receives them if Hayden dies. Cassandra has already copied the dossier 3 more times, headed for the young king, a rival house. And Henrik himself. Yen asked what actually changes for the Marsh people if this plan somehow works. Hayden gives her the real answer. The goal was never to destroy House Westmar. The goal is to rewrite the register, so no child is ever erased in a single night again. Yen decides she isn't letting him walk that bridge without the lowlands standing visibly behind him. Maria backs her instantly. One man alone on a bridge is a negotiator. A man with people standing behind him is a nation. 3 separate messengers slip out that same day, carrying 3 copies of the truth toward 3 very different destinations. Hayden stands on the monastery roof and watches the north, knowing every move has already been made. All that remains is the bridge. At dawn, he steps onto the old stone bridge alone. Gray cloak, no weapon. Only a thin leather notebook underneath. On the far side wait 3,000 spears, church banners, royal banners, and House Westmar's green fox on white. Lord Gottfried Westmar rides forward alone to meet him, 52 years old, tired eyes. A hand that trembles slightly with age. He asks if this is the so-called Marsh Prince. Hayden corrects him. He is Hayden Orwell. Something flickers across Gottfried's face at the name. Recognition of a boy he personally had crossed off the register. Gottfried insists the Orwells are dead. The name is nothing, and he is not afraid of a ghost. Hayden sets the notebook down on the stones between them and says for quiet words, "Read it aloud." "My lord." He explains exactly what it contains, every massacre, every bribe, every seal, and the chancellor's letter approving the crime beforehand. He tells him plainly that this is not the only copy. One already sits on the young king's desk. Another rests with the rival house, a third belongs to Henrik, his own son, who chose to end his father's legacy of filth. At the mention of Henrik's name, Gottfried flinches like he's been struck, and the map catches every trace of it. He calls it a forgery, a lie, fake seals. Hayden simply tells him to check for himself. In front of everyone watching, Gottfried opens the notebook, and his own handwriting stares back at him from the very first page. His expression shifts from contempt to exhaustion to something close to understanding. He finally realizes what this boy actually did. He spent 3 patient years turning every ounce of Gottfried's cruelty into a weapon aimed squarely at his own throat. Behind Hayden, figures begin emerging silently from the fog, unarmed, calm, walking forward one by one. Maria first, then Yun, then Era with her herbs, then Annalise and Lucas, then Renard carrying his son close to his chest, then Cassandra, the wife the Westmers believed drowned 3 years ago, alive and utterly unafraid, then Goran, Eldrick, freed peasants, an old knight from a ruined house, a former thief, an old woman and her granddaughter, 200 people from the lowlands, unarmed, silent, every single one of them once erased, every one of them still standing. Lynette steps forward last, holding a gray banner she sewed herself, 3 sleepless nights. One word stitched at its center. Orwell. The wind catches the fabric, and the name unfurls in front of 3,000 soldiers, who came here to erase it forever. Gottfried looks at the banner, then the notebook, then the silent crowd behind Hayden, and for the first time doesn't know what to do. He could still give the order. He could still burn the notebook. He could still kill Hayden right here on the stones. But the copies are already gone, already delivered, already out of his reach, exactly as planned 3 years earlier. He finally understands the truth. This boy never came here to fight him. He came to show him the war was already over. Gottfried closes the notebook slowly, looks at Hayden one last time, and turns without a single word toward his horse. He mounts heavily, raises his hand, and 3,000 spears slowly march north, away from the bridge, away from the marsh. Hayden stands alone on the stone and watches the army retreat into the fog, and it's finally, truly, over. A month later, Lord Gottfried Westmar dies suddenly at his estate. The official record calls it an accident. Henrik becomes head of the house. His first act pays back every debt his father ever forged against smaller houses. His second act returns the seized Orwell lands. His third act sends him kneeling before an envoy from the lowlands to swear an oath. That envoy is Yun, barefoot, marsh knife on her belt, standing in a marble hall as an ambassador. Not a curiosity. The young king reads the notebook cover to cover, summons the chancellor for an explanation, and the chancellor flees that same night. He's found a week later hiding in the marshes. An irony Maria would appreciate more than anyone alive. 3 months after the bridge, a quiet ceremony takes place in the capital, small, without banners, without fanfare. The royal scribe opens the ancient family register to a single crossed-out line, and dips his pen in red ink. Over the black ink that erased them, he writes one word: Orwell. Beneath it, for more names returned from the dead: Tarn, Ellis, Vale, Crow. 5 erased houses, written back into existence, red ink laid directly over black. Hayden stands in that hall and watches the words settle onto the page: permanent, undeniable, real. Lynette cries quietly beside him. For the first time in 3 years, Hayden finally doesn't. The map inside him doesn't fade. It simply goes still. Like a creature that has run for a very long time and can finally rest. The walk home takes them across the very same bridge, the very same ford. Past the mill where all of this began. Past the hut where he found Era. Past the channel where Derek Fall drowned. Past the falls ford where 8 men still lie. Every step of the way, the map sings quietly. Every trail, every stone, every person. All accounted for, all alive. That evening at the monastery, Lynette brings him hot soup by the hearth. The same herbs he once carried to Era's hut. Yen sharpens a knife on the floor. Annalise counts figures in her ledger. Maria watches the fog from the window. Goran hammers steadily behind the wall, a rhythm as familiar now as a heartbeat. Renard rocks his son to sleep. Yen finally asks what the great strategist of the lowlands plans to do now that it's over. Hayden looks around at every person in that small stone room. Every name he refused to let disappear. He says simply that he's going to sit right here and eat his soup while it's still warm. Lynette rolls her eyes and sets the bowl in front of him. Annalise mutters that Yun should finish her own dinner first. Maria smiles quietly by the window. The hammering behind the wall never stops, steady as ever. Hayden eats in silence, and for the first time in either of his lives, silence doesn't feel like danger. It feels like home. This story never began as a tale about vengeance, even though vengeance runs through every early page of it. It began with a boy left for dead in a swamp, and it ends with a name written back into a book of the living. Every person Hayden gathered along the way carried the exact same wound. Erased, discarded, told they no longer mattered. He never rebuilt a kingdom. He rebuilt something smaller and far harder to destroy. A place where no one gets crossed out twice. The swamp that was supposed to bury him became the one place where every broken person he found finally got to stand back up. And that, in the end, is the whole story. Not a boy who survived a swamp, but a family that grew out of one. Somewhere beneath the black water, in ruins 1,000 years old, something ancient still waits. Patient, quiet, unhurried. But that is a story for another day, because tonight, in a stone room lit by firelight, the people who mattered most were finally fully home. Let's go back to that very first month, because there's a detail worth lingering on longer. When Hayden first pulled himself out of that swamp water, his body wasn't the only thing fighting to survive. His mind was two entirely different men trying to occupy the same skull at once. The old Hayden Orwell, 23, sheltered, a nobleman's son who had never once held a weapon in anger, and the other one, the analyst, who had spent 7 years reading satellite images in war zones half a world away. Neither of them asked for the other. Neither of them could simply walk away. So they learned, slowly, painfully, to share one body, one voice, one set of hands. The nobleman gave him grief, memory, a name worth fighting for. The analyst gave him distance, patience, the terrible calm needed to survive what came next. It's worth remembering that first night in the swamp wasn't luck. It was structure applied to chaos. A man drowning in panic doesn't count crossbowmen's blind spots. A man drowning in grief doesn't time a guard's shift change. Hayden did both, at once, because he had no other choice. That tension never fully disappeared. It just got quieter as the months went on. Every person he saved afterward was, in some small way, both halves of him keeping a promise. The nobleman's promise: never let a family disappear the way his did. The analyst's promise: never let sentiment get in the way of the plan. Both promises somehow pointed toward the exact same mill in the exact same swamp. Let's return to Era for a moment, because her story deserves more than a passing mention. Before the fire, before the accusations, she was simply the village healer, trusted, needed, invisible in the way useful people often are. Then a bad harvest came, then sick livestock, then frightened people looking for someone to blame. It's an old, ugly pattern. Fear needs a target, and a woman who knows more about herbs than her neighbors makes an easy one. She didn't run because she was guilty. She ran because a torch doesn't care about guilt. When Hayden found her, she wasn't just injured. She was a woman who had learned the hard way that usefulness offers no protection. That's part of why she tested him with a knife first and words second. And it's part of why, once she decided to trust him, that trust never wavered again. Every poultice she made after that, every roof she thatched, every person she healed, was her quiet answer to that mob with torches. You tried to erase me. I'm still here, and now I keep other people alive. Goran's story runs on the same current, just with hammer marks instead of herbs. 12 years alone in the marshes will do strange things to a man's hands, and stranger things to his voice. He hadn't spoken more than a few sentences a week, before Hayden found him sitting with a broken sword across his lap. That sword wasn't scrap metal to him. It was the last physical proof that he had once mattered to someone. A young baron he'd forged for, long dead, along with any reason for Goran to keep working. When Hayden laid a hammer, pliers, and chisels down in front of him, he wasn't just offering tools. He was offering Goran a reason to pick up a hammer again after 12 years of silence. It's no accident that Goran's first knife in over a decade came out crooked, black with impurities, imperfect. It's also no accident that he held it like it was something precious, because to him, it was. Every blade after that got a little straighter, a little cleaner, a little more like the work he used to be proud of. By the time winter ended, Goran wasn't just forging knives. He was forging his own way back into being a person who mattered. Renard's arc deserves the same kind of attention, because a one-armed soldier isn't just a soldier missing a limb. He's a man the army used up, and then discarded the moment he stopped being useful to it. No pension worth mentioning, no home waiting for him, just a pregnant wife and a road leading nowhere in particular. When he asked Hayden what he wanted in return for shelter, it wasn't suspicion, it was habit. Everyone who had ever given him anything before had wanted something back, usually more than they gave. Hayden's answer, nothing for now, must have sounded almost insulting in its simplicity. But 3 days later, Renard was already at the anvil, because gratitude for a man like him isn't spoken, it's demonstrated with labor. And when his son Hayden was born under that stone roof, something in Renard finally settled into place. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He had a reason to keep building, one hand at a time. Let's linger on Annalise for a moment too, because her arc is quieter, but it cuts just as deep. Everyone in her life had used her intelligence as a tool for their own benefit, never once as something that belonged to her. Her father used her sharp mind in negotiations. Suitors valued her as a clever match, a good investment. Nobody ever asked her what she wanted to build with that mind of hers, only what she could build for them. So when Hayden offered her the trading post with no strings attached, her own name, her own rules, it confused her more than it pleased her. She asked him directly why he was doing this, because in her experience, offers like that always came with hidden cost. His answer was almost disappointingly plain. He needed a trading post that worked, and she was the best person alive to run it. No manipulation, no leverage, just a simple trade of skill for opportunity. That plainness was, in its own way, the most radical thing anyone had ever offered her. And she repaid it the only way she knew how, with precision, with columns that balanced to the last coin, with a business that never once failed them. It's worth pausing here to talk about the map itself, because by this point it had become something more than a tool. It wasn't a photograph in his mind. It was closer to a living organism, one that fed on footsteps and starved without them. Every new trail widened it, every new face sharpened it, every secret deepened it, and every overload reminded him, painfully, that it had a price, paid in blood from his own nose and hours of blindness afterward. Maria's warning about the officer who carved names into his own walls wasn't a story meant to frighten him. It was a mirror, a version of himself that could exist if he never learned when to stop absorbing. He never fully learned that lesson, but he learned to lean on the people around him instead of the map alone. That, more than any trap or ambush, might be the real reason he survived as long as he did. A map can tell you where the danger is. It can't hold your hand while you wait for a fever to break. Only people can do that, and by the end of the first year, Hayden had built himself an entire house full of them. Let's go back to the night the 10 mercenaries drowned. Because there's a detail worth sitting with a little longer. Hayden didn't build that trap out of hatred. He built it out of arithmetic. 10 armed men against 7 civilians isn't a fight. It's a massacre waiting for a starting signal. The only way to win that kind of math is to never let the fight happen in the first place. That's the whole philosophy the lowlands would be built on, long before it had a name. Not strength against strength, but structure against chaos, patience against aggression, information against numbers. It's a philosophy that looks almost gentle from a distance, right up until it drowns 8 men in liquid peat without a single blow struck. And it's a philosophy that cost Hayden something every single time he used it. His hands shook after Derek fall. They shook again after the falls forward. They never stopped shaking entirely. That's important, because it means none of this ever became easy for him. It just became necessary. A man who kills without feeling anything is a monster. A man who kills anyway, knowing exactly what it cost him, is something else entirely. Let's talk about Maria Ashford's arrival a little more closely, because it's easy to rush past how dangerous that meeting really was. A former Crown intelligence agent walking straight up to a hidden encampment is either the best gift imaginable or the worst possible trap. Hayden had no way to be completely certain which one she was, not at first. So he did the only thing his training allowed. He verified everything, slowly, patiently, over days instead of minutes. Every question he asked her wasn't just conversation. It was cross-referencing, testing consistency, watching for the smallest crack, her pulse, her posture, the way her eyes moved when she talked about the houses she'd helped destroy. None of it broke. None of it wavered. And that consistency, more than any single answer, is what finally earned her a place at the mill. It's worth noting that Maria never once apologized for what she'd done in the Crown service. She simply stopped doing it and started doing something else instead. That distinction mattered to Hayden more than any confession could have. Actions carry more weight than regret. And once she committed to the lowlands, she committed completely, teaching Hayden everything the Crown had ever taught her. Chains of command, forged documents, the exact mechanics of how a great house destroys a smaller one. Every lesson she gave him became another brick in the wall. That would eventually stop Lord Gottfried Westmark cold. Let's slow down on the trading post for a moment, because it's easy to treat it as a footnote next to all the fighting. But the trading post is arguably the single most important thing Hayden ever built, because it turns survival into sustainability. A hidden camp that only survives on stolen supplies and lucky hunts eventually runs out of luck. A camp with a working economy can outlast almost anything, because it doesn't depend on any one person's risk. Every knife Goran forged became silver. Every herbera gathered became flour. Every trade Annalise closed became another week of food. That quiet, unglamorous machinery of commerce is what let the lowlands survive long enough to matter. Politically, armies can be outmaneuvered once. Economies keep working every single day, whether anyone's watching or not. It's also worth remembering how carefully Hayden kept himself out of the spotlight. During all of this, he never wanted to be a warlord or a rebel leader. He wanted, more than anything, to be forgotten by everyone who mattered. That's why he sold knives disguised as a peddler instead of raiding supply caravans for glory. That's why he negotiated with Henrik in the shadows of a private study, instead of storming the Westmar estate. Every single move he made was designed to look small, forgettable, beneath notice, right up until the moment it wasn't. Let's return to Yun for a while, because her arc is quieter than most, but no less important. She grew up caught precisely between two worlds that both rejected her for the same reason, being neither fully one thing nor the other. The Marsh clan called her half-blood. The dry lands saw her as something wild and unwelcome. She learned early to trust almost no one, because trust, in her experience, had never once been rewarded. That's exactly why her first meeting with Hayden went the way it did, cold-guarded. Weapons half-raised the entire time. It's also why his approach worked. He didn't ask her for anything. He simply told her who he was and let her decide what to do with that. Nobody had ever given her that kind of respect before. The freedom to judge him honestly instead of being pressured into an answer. When she finally started visiting the mill on her own, it wasn't loyalty at first. It was curiosity about a place where being different didn't seem to matter. Slowly, that curiosity became something else. A place where she genuinely belonged for the first time in her entire life. By the time she stood in the marble halls of the Westmar estate as an official ambassador, that transformation was complete. Not a Marsh dweller playing a role, not a half-blood tolerated out of necessity. An equal, representing an equal power. Let's talk more about Lynette, because her reunion with Hayden carries weight that's easy to underestimate. She wasn't just a survivor of the massacre. She was living proof that the old Hayden Orwell hadn't been completely erased. Every memory she carried of their childhood together was a piece of him that existed nowhere else in the world. When she embraced him in that infirmary, she wasn't just reuniting with family. She was anchoring him back to a self he'd nearly lost entirely. That's why, of every thread on his enormous map, hers remained the most delicate and the most important. Every other person told him who he had become. Only Lynette could tell him who he used to be. And it's fitting, in the end, that it was her hands that sewed the banner he carried onto that final bridge. 3 sleepless nights, one careful stitch at a time, spelling out a name that had been legally dead for 3 years. That banner wasn't just fabric. It was the old Hayden Orwell and the new one, standing together on the same pole. Let's talk about Cassandra's escape a little more closely too, because the plan itself deserves more credit than it usually gets. Staging a death convincingly enough to fool a suspicious husband and a paranoid father-in-law takes weeks of precision, not luck. It starts with a cough, small, easy to dismiss, planted the way you plant the first seed of any long con. Then fever, carefully timed with herbs Erin knew exactly how to dose without causing real harm. Then the request to move to the country house, framed as her own idea, so no one suspects a plan behind it. Every piece had to land naturally, because one suspicious detail would have brought the entire escape crashing down. And the final piece, address and to words left on a riverbank, had to be simple enough to be believed instantly. Forgive me, nothing more. Grief fills in the rest of the story on its own, without anyone needing to lie outright. It worked exactly as planned, because Hayden had learned by then that the best lies are the ones nobody has to actively tell. You simply range the truth so that people draw the wrong conclusion entirely on their own. When Cassandra finally reached the monastery, wet and frozen and free, that plan had cost months of patient, invisible work. And she repaid it the only way she knew how, by pouring everything she learned inside that gilded cage into Hayden's growing dossier. Every letter she'd secretly copied, every conversation she'd memorized, became another nail in Lord Gottfried's coffin. Let's revisit the final preparations before the bridge, because that stretch deserves more than a passing mention too. 3,000 spears isn't a number a person can fight their way past. It's a number you have to outthink entirely. Hayden knew he couldn't repeat the same logistical sabotage that worked against 200 men. The scale was simply too large. 10 suppliers instead of 3, 20 captains instead of 5, a royal charter behind it all, backed by the crown itself. So instead of trying to dismantle the machine, he decided to remove its only real reason for existing. If the crimes behind the army became public before a single spear was raised, the army itself would become meaningless. That's the entire logic behind walking onto that bridge with nothing but a notebook and empty hands. Not bravery for its own sake. Calculation, the same cold, patient calculation that had carried him through every single choice before it. The difference this time was that the calculation depended on people, not traps, not terrain, not timing. It depended on every single person he had gathered over 3 years choosing to stand behind him, without being asked twice. And every single one of them did. That's the real ending of this story. Not the moment Gottfried turned his horse round, but the moment 200 people walked out of the fog together. Because a notebook full of crimes can be burned. A single man can be killed in an instant. But 200 people who refuse to disappear quietly are something no army, however large, can simply erase overnight. Lord Gottfried understood that the second he saw them emerging from the mist, behind Hayden's shoulder. It wasn't the evidence in his hands that finally broke him. It was the sight of everyone he tried so hard to erase, standing whole, alive, unafraid. Let's slow down on that moment itself, because it deserves to be felt in full, not rushed past. Fog rolling low across an ancient stone bridge that belongs to neither the dry lands nor the marsh. A young man in a plain gray cloak, standing utterly alone against 3,000 spears glinting faintly through the mist. Behind him, the quiet trickle of footsteps growing louder, more numerous, until an entire community stands at his back. Maria first, upright and steady, a woman who once helped destroy houses now standing to defend one. Young beside her, barefoot even in the cold, a half-blood outcast now speaking for an entire people. Era, her burned arm still wrapped, carrying herbs like a soldier carries a weapon, because healing was always her form of defiance. Annalise, spine straight, chin high, her little brother Lucas gripping her hand the way he had the very first day they arrived. Renard, one arm holding his infant son close, the other having once held a hammer, a shovel, and finally a purpose. Cassandra, the woman the world believed drowned 3 years ago, standing in plain sight, utterly unafraid of being seen. Goran, hammer resting on his shoulder. The same hands that had forged 18 crooked knives out of grief and rust. Eldrick with his cracked glasses, the peasants who once chopped wood to burn off their rage. The old knight of a ruined house, the thief turned scout. An old woman and her granddaughter, that same silent 5-year-old, now staring at 3,000 soldiers without flinching once. 200 people in total. Every last one of them once told by the world that they no longer mattered. Every one of them alive, standing in open defiance of everything that had tried to erase them. And at the very front, Lynette, small and fair-haired, raising a banner she had sewn with her own hands through 3 sleepless nights. The wind catches the fabric and unfurls it fully, one word visible from horizon to horizon. Orwell, a name Lord Gottfried himself had personally struck from the register 3 years earlier, now flying above a living crowd. That's the image this entire story was building toward from the very first line. A boy left for dead, standing whole in the open at last. Not through violence, not through vengeance, through patience, through structure, through 3 years of quietly refusing to disappear. Let's talk about what happened to each of these people after that morning, because their stories didn't simply end on the bridge. Era stayed at the mill for the rest of her life. Though it stopped being called the mill within a few short years, it became known simply as the healing house. The first place any wounded traveler in the lowlands was brought. She trained others in her methods, passing on everything she knew, until her knowledge outlived any single pair of hands. Goran kept forging long after his fingers should have stopped working entirely, teaching to young apprentices everything he knew. He never forgot the young baron whose sword had broken all those years ago, but he stopped mourning him quite so heavily. There were simply too many living people who needed blades, tools, and hinges for him to spend all his time looking backward. Renard became the closest thing the lowlands ever had to a standing captain, training new arrivals in basic defense. He never let his missing arms slow him down, and he never let anyone forget that a shovel had once meant just as much to him as a sword. Hayden grew up hearing the story of his own birth told and rattled by the fire. A child born free in a place built entirely for people like him. Annalise expanded the trading post into something far larger, a genuine market connecting the lowlands to 3 separate baronies. She never fully let go of her old caution, but she stopped needing to guard herself against everyone she worked with. Lucas grew from a silent, watchful boy into a sharp young trader working directly under his sister's guidance. Maria eventually stepped back from active intelligence work, training a new generation instead of gathering secrets herself. She never fully lost the habit of reading a room the instant she entered it, but she used that skill to protect people now, not exploit them. Yun moved fluidly between the Marsh clan and the lowlands for the rest of her life, belonging fully to both at once. The clan that once called her half-blood eventually came to see her as their strongest bridge to the outside world. Cassandra became a quiet, steady presence at the trading post, writing her own letters for the first time in her adult life. She never remarried and never particularly wanted to. Freedom for her was reward enough after 3 years in a gilded cage. Lynette stayed close to Hayden for the rest of her days, the living thread tying the lowlands back to the family that started it all. She eventually took over training the growing community's scribes, ensuring every story, every name, was written down and preserved. Henrik Westmar ruled his house with none of his father's cruelty, honoring every debt, every treaty, every promise he made at the bridge. He and Hayden never became close friends exactly, but they became something rare between two former enemies, reliable allies. Tobias, the barefoot boy who once traded news for dried fish, grew into the lowlands' chief courier, running messages across 3 baronies. He never forgot that a single act of kindness, one piece of dried meat handed to a hungry child, had changed the entire course of his life. Eldrick kept meticulous records for decades, his cracked glasses eventually replaced, though he never quite broke the habit of wiping them on his shirt. His ledgers became the closest thing the lowlands had to a written history, dry facts concealing an extraordinary story underneath. Every person who arrived after that first year heard some version of the same tale, told slightly differently depending on who was speaking, but the core of it never changed. A boy left for dead built a place where no one else ever had to feel that alone again. Let's return, finally, to that ancient archive still humming quietly beneath the black water, because its story isn't quite finished either. Hayden never went back down into those flooded ruins during that first turbulent year. There was simply no time, and no need. But the map inside him never stopped sensing it, a faint pulse in the corner of his awareness. Patient, waiting, watching. Something about that place had chosen him the very night he crawled out of the swamp, with a rope still around his neck. The ability itself, the living map, the lines of light, the instant understanding of terrain and people alike, had to come from somewhere. And somewhere, deep beneath 1,000 years of silt and stone, an ancient intelligence had been waiting exactly as long for someone like him. An operator, stable, active. The very first entry of its kind and longer than anyone alive could remember. What that archive actually is, what it wants, and what waking it fully might cost, remains a story still unwritten. But it's worth remembering, as this tale comes to its close, that Hayden's real strength was never really about that gift at all. Plenty of people in this story never had access to glowing lines of light, or three-dimensional maps stitched into their minds. Era's strength was her hands and her patience. Goran's was his stubbornness. Renard's was his loyalty. Annalise's was her mind. Maria's was her honesty about her own past mistakes. Yun's was her refusal to belong fully to anyone else's expectations. Lynette's was her memory, carrying an entire erased family forward simply by refusing to let it be forgotten. Hayden's map only ever showed him where people were. It never once told him how to earn their trust. That part, the hardest part, he had to learn the same way everyone else in this story did. Slowly. Honestly. One kept promise at a time. Every knife he brought back wasn't just supplies. It was proof that he intended to stay. To keep showing up day after day. Every roof he repaired, every wound he treated, every debt he quietly settled, was another brick laid in a wall built entirely out of trust. That's the real weapon that brought down House Westmar in the end. Not a trap, not an ambush. Not even the notebook itself. It was 200 people who chose, freely, to stand behind one boy who had once been left for dead in a swamp. No army can easily withstand that kind of loyalty, because loyalty like that isn't bought. It's built, one small act of care at a time. Let's close, then, the way the story always seemed destined to close. Back at that same stone hearth in the monastery. Soup in a wooden bowl, still steaming, a fire crackling low and steady. The familiar rhythm of a hammer striking metal beyond the wall. Yun sharpening a knife she doesn't strictly need to sharpen, just for the comfort of the motion. Annalise bent over her ledger, counting figures that used to mean survival and now simply mean growth. Maria watching the fog outside the window the way she always does, alert out of habit rather than fear. Renard rocking his son to sleep, a lullaby with no real words, just warmth carried in a familiar tune. Era drying herbs along the walls. The same quiet work she was doing the very first day Hayden found her. Cassandra writing something entirely her own. For the first time in her adult life belonging to no one but herself. Lynette setting a second bowl down beside Hayden's, because she never quite lets him eat a meal completely alone. And Hayden, sitting in the middle of all of it, finally, fully, present. Not the frightened boy who woke up choking on swamp water 3 years earlier. Not the cold, calculating analyst who once counted crossbowmen's blind spots without a flicker of feeling. Something built from both of those men, tempered by 3 years of loss, patience, and quiet. Stubborn love. He eats his soup. It's hot, it's simple, it's exactly enough. Outside, the fog rolls gently over a swamp that once tried to swallow him whole and instead became the place he calls home. Somewhere beneath that black water, an ancient archive rests a little easier, having finally found the successor it waited 1,000 years for. Somewhere north, in a capital far from the marsh, a family register carries 5 names in fresh red ink over old black scars. Somewhere closer, in a mill-turned healing house, a blacksmith's hammer keeps its steady rhythm. Unhurried, unbroken, alive. This was never really a story about revenge, no matter how many enemies fell along the way to its ending. It was a story about a boy who refused to stay erased, and who then refused to let anyone else stay erased either. Every person who walked out of that fog behind him on the bridge had once believed their story was already over. Hayden simply proved, patiently, methodically, one rescued life at a time, that an ending isn't always final. Sometimes it's just the moment right before someone decides to start counting the mistakes, instead of giving up entirely. That was true the night he crawled out of a swamp with his hands bound and a hole in his side. And it stayed true every single day afterward, all the way to a quiet hearth, a warm bowl of soup, and a room full of people who finally belonged somewhere. The lowlands endured long after that bridge, long after Godfried's name faded from memory, long after the young king grew old on his throne. It became, in time, less of a hidden refuge and more of a living promise. A place where being cast aside no longer meant being forgotten. New names arrived every season, carrying the same old story in slightly different words. Killed, driven out, erased. And every single one of them found the same answer waiting for them. That Hayden once found in a swamp herbalist's rusty knife. Someone willing to sit down, set their own weapon aside, and simply ask what happened. That, in the end, is the whole quiet secret behind everything Hayden ever built. Long before there were maps or notebooks or bridges, it started the moment he chose curiosity over conquest, patience over panic, people over power. A military analyst mind gave him the tools to survive that first terrible night in the water. But it was a grieving nobleman's heart that turned survival into something worth building. For other people too. Neither half of him could have done it alone. Together, they built a home out of a swamp that history had written off completely. And somewhere in that quiet stone room, with the fire low and the soup finally finished, Hayden allows himself something he rarely does. He lets himself simply be still. No map pulsing, no thread to track. No plan waiting to be set into motion. Just warmth and firelight and the sound of people he loves breathing easily around him. Lynette watches him from across the hearth and for the first time in 3 years, sees something close to peace on his face. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't need to. Some things are better felt in silence than spoken aloud. Outside, the marsh breathes slowly in the dark, fog rising and falling like the chest of some enormous, sleeping creature. It is no longer a place of exile. It hasn't been for a very long time. It is simply home for every person who once had nowhere left to go. And beneath it all, deep in flooded stone corridors 1,000 years old, something ancient sleeps a little more peacefully than it has in centuries. Its long wait is finally over. Its successor is exactly what it always hoped for. Patient, careful, unshakably human. Whatever comes next for Hayden Orwell, whatever secrets that archive still holds beneath the black water, remains a story for another night. Tonight, there's only soup, firelight, and a family built not from blood, but from every person the world tried to throw away. Tonight, there's only the sound of a hammer striking steel, steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. Tonight, a name once erased in black ink burns quietly in red across an old, dusty register far to the north. Tonight, 200 people sleep soundly under stone roofs that were once nothing but ruins and rot. Tonight, a boy who was left for dead in a swamp finally, completely, belongs somewhere. And that, more than any battle won or any enemy defeated, is the true ending of this story. Not a crown, not a title, not even revenge, fully satisfied. Just a hearth, a bowl of soup, and a room full of people who refuse to be forgotten ever again. If there is a lesson buried inside 3 years of traps, trade routes, and quiet betrayals turned into victories, it might be this. Power built on fear collapses the moment someone stops being afraid of it. Power built on people, on trust, on patiently kept promises, only grows stronger with every single year that passes. Lord Gottfried Westmark commanded 3,000 spears and still lost everything the moment 200 unarmed people refused to run. Hayden Orwell commanded nothing at all when he first woke up choking on swamp water, and built an entire nation from nothing but patience. That contrast is the real heart of this story, more than any single fight, trap, or twist along the way. Strength, in the end, was never about how many spears you could raise. It was always about how many people would still be standing behind you when everything else was stripped away. Hayden learned that lesson slowly, one rescued life at a time, starting with a frightened herbalist holding a rusty knife. He never forgot it, not on the bridge, not in the years that followed, not for the rest of his long, quiet life in the marsh he once feared. And so the swamp that swallowed a murdered noble family. That terrible night gave something back in return years later. Not vengeance alone, though that came too, in its own patient, bloodless way. It gave back a family, larger and stranger, and far more resilient than the one that had been taken. Built from outcasts, thieves, healers, soldiers, merchants, and one very tired, very determined young man who refused to stay dead. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of your own personal swamp, hands bound, everything you knew burned to ash behind you, remember Hayden Orwell, and remember that survival was never really the hardest part of his story. The hardest part was choosing, every single day afterward, to build something worth surviving for. That choice, made quietly, patiently, one kept promise at a time, is what turned a drowned boy into the founder of the lowlands. Not a single dramatic moment of triumph, but 3 years of small, unglamorous acts of stubborn, deliberate kindness. A shovel handed to a one-armed veteran, a handful of herbs carried back to a stranger's hut, a hammer laid down in front of an old blacksmith. None of those moments looked like victory at the time. All of them turned out to be exactly that. So, when the fog rolls back over that ancient bridge tonight, and the marsh settles into its familiar quiet breathing, somewhere inside that stone monastery, a fire still burns low, a hammer still strikes steady, and a family still gathers close. Not because fate demanded it, and not because any prophecy foretold it, but because one boy decided, in the coldest, darkest moment of his life, to start counting instead of giving up. And everyone he counted, one by one, chose to stand beside him when it finally mattered most. That is the story of Hayden Orwell, the boy the world tried to erase. and the man who refused to let anyone else be erased again. It began in black water, with a rope around his neck and a knife wound under his ribs. It ends by a warm hearth, with a bowl of soup, and a room full of people who finally, truly, belong. Between those two moments lies 3 years of maps drawn in light, threads woven from patience, and a family rebuilt one broken person at a time. The swamp that was meant to be his grave became, instead, the foundation of everything he ever built afterward. And the name that was struck from a register in black ink now stands written back in red, for every future reader of that book to see. Orwell, not erased, not forgotten, standing, still exactly where it was always meant to be. Some stories end with a crown. This one ends with a hammer, steady rhythm, a bowl of hot soup, and a fire that never quite goes out. Some victories are loud, marked by banners and trumpets and crowds cheering in the streets. This one was quiet, marked by 200 silent footsteps emerging from the fog on an old stone bridge. Quiet victories, it turns out, can be every bit as absolute as loud ones. And sometimes they last far longer. Because a crown can be stolen, a throne can be overturned, a kingdom can fall in a single violent night, just as House Orwell once did. But a family built on trust, tested by 3 brutal years and countless small acts of loyalty, is far harder to erase twice. Lord Gottfried Westmar learned that lesson standing on a fog-covered bridge, watching his own crimes read back to him in his own handwriting. Hayden Orwell learned it long before that, kneeling in swamp water, counting crossbowmen's blind spots with the rope still around his neck. And every single person who followed him afterward learned it too. One kept promise, one shared meal, one quiet act of kindness at a time. That is why, when the fog finally lifted over the marsh that had once been called nothing but a place to disappear, it revealed not emptiness, but a living, breathing community that refused, stubbornly and completely, to vanish. The lowlands stood and stands still wherever this story is told, wherever a name once crossed out finds its way back into the light. So if you take nothing else from 3 years spent inside a swamp with a boy who should have died in the first 10 minutes, take this: being erased is not the same as being finished. Sometimes the person the world writes off completely is the very same person who ends up rewriting the entire book. Hayden Orwell did exactly that, one careful, patient, deliberate step at a time. And in the end, that quiet, stubborn persistence proved far stronger than any army Lord Gottfried Westmar could ever have raised against him. The fire in that stone hearth burns on tonight, warm and steady, exactly the way it has every night since the day the mill first became a home. Somewhere close by, Goran's hammer keeps its rhythm, steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat that simply refuses to stop. Somewhere close by, Era hangs another bundle of drying herbs along a wall that has held far worse storms than tonight's quiet fog. Somewhere close by, Yun sits barefoot on cold stone, sharpening a blade she may never need, simply because the motion feels like peace. Somewhere close by, Annalise closes her ledger for the night, satisfied for once that every column finally balances. Somewhere close by, Renard hums a wordless lullaby to a son who was born free, in a place his father once thought impossible to build. Somewhere close by, Maria watches the fog through an old stone window, calm now, no longer waiting for danger that never comes. Somewhere close by, Cassandra writes her own words in her own hand for herself and no one else, for the very first time in years. Somewhere close by, Lynette sets a second bowl of soup down beside her cousin's, the way she has every single night since the day she found him again. And at the center of it all, Hayden Orwell sits quietly by the fire, finally still, finally warm, finally completely home. The boy who was left for dead in a swamp became the man who refused to let anyone else share that same fate. The name that was struck from a register in black ink now stands written back in red, permanent, undeniable, alive. The swamp that was meant to bury him instead became the foundation of a family stronger than the one that was taken from him. Every trap he set, every thread he wove, every quiet promise he kept, led to exactly this moment, and nothing less. A hearth, a bowl of soup, a room full of people who finally, truly belonged to one another. That is the story of Hayden Orwell, told from the first cold breath he drew in black swamp water to the last warm bite of soup by a steady fire. A story that began with erasure and ended with a name written permanently back into the world. A story that began with a boy alone and ended with a family that no army, no chancellor, and no crown could ever fully take apart again. Somewhere beneath the black water, an ancient archive rests easy, its long wait finally over. Somewhere north, in a capital far from the marsh, a young king rules a little more carefully, having read exactly what unchecked cruelty can cost. Somewhere closer, in a swamp once meant only for the forgotten, a fire burns steadily on, night after night, unbroken. And that fire, more than any battle won or any enemy defeated, is the true legacy Hayden Orwell left behind. Not a crown, not a throne, not even the satisfaction of vengeance, fully paid. Just warmth, shared freely, with everyone the world once tried so hard to throw away. A hearth that never went cold. A hammer that never stopped striking. A name that was never erased again. That is the story of the boy who crawled out of a swamp with a rope round his neck, and built a home for everyone who followed him out. And in that quiet stone room, warmed by firelight and full of people who finally belonged, the story of Hayden Orwell finally, completely came home.